The village of Nwand rested between rolling green hills and fields of gold, where the people worked with songs and laughter under the watchful eye of the sun. Smoke from the forges curled gently into the sky each day, carrying the scent of iron and earth. Among those forges worked Arya, a young woman with hands skilled enough to bend metal into beauty and strength. Her bracelets, blades, and ornaments were prized throughout neighboring lands, but it wasn't her skill that made her beloved, it was her spirit. She worked with quiet pride, believing that her craft was not just labor but legacy. She forged tools that helped farmers till the land, rings that joined lovers, and weapons to guard the village when shadows approached. Her father had taught her that every strike of the hammer carried the heartbeat of their ancestors, and she never forgot that truth. Life in Nwand was simple but strong. The elders gathered under the baobab tree to make decisions, children ran barefoot between the huts, and the people lived as though the soil itself protected them. But the peace was fragile, the outside world was hungry, and whispers of raiders drifted through the wind. They said slavers roamed nearby, hunting for the young and strong, trading lives for silver coins and favor with distant kings. Each night, villagers strengthened the gates and prayed to the spirits for safety. Arya worked late that final evening before the storm came. Sparks danced from her forge as she shaped a blade unlike any other, smooth, balanced, beautiful, and strong. She meant to gift it to the village's defenders, believing it might one day protect her people. Her hammer's rhythm echoed through the night air, mingling with the chirping of crickets and the hum of distant drums. She didn't see the figure watching her from the shadows, the trusted elder, Chief Bako, whose eyes had grown dark with greed. He had long envied Arya's skill and the love the people gave her. And when the raiders promised him gold and protection in exchange for one woman of worth, he saw his chance. At dawn the sky turned red with dust. The raiders came like thunder, horses screaming, blades flashing. The villagers ran to defend their homes, but betrayal struck from within. Chief Bako had left the gates unguarded. He shouted false orders, spreading confusion, and when Arya rushed to save a child, he seized her arm and dragged her toward the attackers. "Take her," he hissed, his trembling hands clutching a pouch of silver. "She is the one you want, she forges power itself." The raiders laughed as they threw chains around Arya's wrists, heavy and cold. She fought, but for every blow she landed, another came harder. Her own strength became her undoing. The more she resisted, the more they valued her as a prize. The smoke of burning homes rose behind her as she was led away. The villagers shouted, some in terror, others in shame, but no one moved to stop the betrayal. The clang of metal on her wrists sounded like a cruel echo of her craft. The same hands that once forged freedom now bore the weight of bondage. She turned once, her eyes locking on the forge she had built, the one place where she had shaped the dreams of her people. The fire still burned, but without her, it would soon fade. As they rode away, Arya's heart split in two, one half burning with grief, the other with defiance. She whispered to herself that chains could not bind the soul, that the fire within her would not die. The raiders mocked her quiet words, but they did not know what they carried. The metal around her wrists glimmered faintly in the sun, as though recognizing its maker. Even in captivity, her creation answered her spirit. That night, as they camped near the river, the leader of the raiders, a scarred man with gold teeth, examined her chains and laughed. "A fine blacksmith indeed," he said, unaware that the very metal he admired would one day undo him. Arya sat by the fire, her hands heavy, her spirit burning brighter than the flames. She thought of her father's words, "Every strike of the hammer carries the heartbeat of our ancestors." She closed her eyes, and though no forge stood before her, she felt the rhythm still alive within. Back in Nwand, the people mourned but did not speak of what had happened. Chief Bako silenced their grief with fear, reminding them that she had been chosen by fate. But whispers began anyway, whispers that the forge still glowed at night though no one fed it, that the wind carried the sound of hammering, soft but steady, as if Arya's spirit refused to leave her craft behind. Far from home, in chains and shadow, Arya began to listen to those same whispers. The fire that once obeyed her hands now stirred in her heart. Every link in her chains pulsed faintly with warmth, a reminder that metal could be shaped, even this. Her mind sharpened like a blade, and though her captors thought her broken, she was learning their weaknesses, their routines, their greed. What they didn't understand was that the girl they chained was not merely a prisoner, she was the forge itself. And soon what they had bound would rise again, reshaping not only metal but destiny. The march began before sunrise, when the mist still clung to the fields and the air smelled of dust and fear. Arya walked barefoot through thorns and stones, her wrists weighed down by iron chains that bit into her skin. Around her, dozens of others stumbled, men, women, and children taken from their villages, each carrying the same look of exhaustion and silent despair. The slavers rode ahead on horseback, shouting orders, laughing cruelly, their whips slicing the morning air. Every step felt endless. The sun rose high, turning the iron hot against Arya's skin. The others cried softly, praying for mercy, but she stayed silent, her breath steady, her eyes watching the chains. They were crude but strong, forged from a dark metal that shimmered faintly in certain light, a shimmer she recognized. It was the same kind of where she once used in her own forge. Only this felt alive. Each time she stumbled, the chains clanked, and she swore she felt a pulse within them, faint like a heartbeat. When the slavers stopped for rest, she examined them quietly, pretending to shift for comfort. Beneath the layer of grime, she could see patterns, not scratches from use but faint runes, like markings burned into the metal itself. Her fingers traced them and warmth tingled beneath her skin. It was as if the chains knew her, recognized her touch. That night, they made camp near a dry riverbed. Fires burned in a circle, keeping the captives under watch. The slavers drank, boasting about how much gold they would earn at the next market. They laughed as they pointed to the captives, counting them like livestock. When one mentioned Arya, his tone carried both greed and curiosity. "The blacksmith girl," he sneered. "She keeps whispering to her chains like they'll set her free. Perhaps she's already mad." Arya didn't react. She sat in silence, her hands resting on her knees, the chains pooling around her like a heavy snake. Her mind drifted back to her forge, to the ringing of hammers, the hiss of steam, the smell of molten iron. That sound, that rhythm had always been her comfort. Now she began to breathe in that rhythm again. Slowly, calmly. The chains shifted. No one noticed at first, not even the guard nearest her. But as the night deepened, a faint hum began to rise from the metal, a vibration so subtle it could have been the wind. Arya closed her eyes and whispered words only the iron could hear. She remembered the way her father had spoken to his tools, always treating them like living things, capable of loyalty or rebellion depending on how they were forged. "Metal remembers its maker," he had once said. "It knows the hand that shapes it." Her voice was soft, almost like a prayer. "You were made from the same earth I worked," she murmured to the chains. "You were meant to serve creation, not cruelty. You do not belong to them." The iron pulsed once, faintly, like acknowledgement. A spark of warmth traveled up her arms, and for the first time since her capture, she felt no fear. Across the camp, a guard stirred. He frowned, glancing toward her, but saw nothing unusual, just another exhausted prisoner muttering in the dark. He shrugged and went back to his drink. The moon climbed high. Arya's eyes gleamed in its pale light as she continued to whisper, her words slow and deliberate. She was not begging for freedom, she was forging a bond. The metal had been forced to serve, just as she had. And in that shared captivity she felt kinship. The faint runes on the chains shimmered faintly, invisible to human eyes but alive beneath the surface. By dawn, the slavers roused the captives again, shouting for them to move. The march resumed, but something had changed. Arya's chains no longer dragged her down, they moved almost in rhythm with her steps. The iron seemed lighter, or perhaps she had simply learned how to carry it. Around her, other captives began to notice. "How do you still stand straight?" one woman whispered through cracked lips. Arya only smiled faintly. "Because the chains don't own me," she said quietly. "They listen." The woman gave her a strange look, half in awe, half in disbelief. But as the day went on, even she began to sense it, the faint hum in the air, the rhythm that followed Arya's steps. That night, as the fires burned low, one of the slavers reached for Arya's chain to tighten it. The moment his hand touched the metal, he recoiled with a curse. "Hot!" he shouted, shaking his hand. But when another checked, the iron was cool. They called him a fool and laughed, though uneasily. Arya said nothing, her gaze calm and distant. She knew what she had felt, the chain responding to her, not them. She began to see that the metal's power wasn't just in its strength, but in its memory. The raiders thought they had bound her, but what they had really done was give her the very tools she needed to forge her freedom. Each night after that, she whispered again, not in fear but in command. The words grew bolder, the hum stronger. The iron no longer felt foreign. It was beginning to listen fully, to remember the hands that once shaped its kin and wand. And somewhere deep within that metal, something ancient stirred, the first spark of rebellion, waiting for the moment her will would strike it into flame. The journey ended at dusk, after endless days of marching through dust, hunger, and humiliation. The slavers dragged their captives into a walled city whose towers glowed with the reflection of firelight. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and molten metal, a place of industry, not mercy. The clang of hammers echoed like thunder from every corner. Arya lifted her head, her eyes narrowing. Even before she saw the forge, she could feel it, the pull of iron, the whisper of flame calling her name. They sold her quickly. The buyer was a tall man with eyes like cold steel and a voice that could command silence without raising its tone. He was known as Master Oben, the king's chief blacksmith and warforger, a man whose creations decided the fate of armies. His gaze lingered on Arya longer than most. "You worked with iron before?" he asked the slaver. "She's a blacksmith's daughter," the man replied. "Knows her way around fire, or so they say. Strong for her size." Oben nodded once. "Good. I need hands that don't tremble." Arya was led through the master's compound, where smoke curled from furnaces and sparks lit the air like fireflies. Men worked half-naked under the heat, hammering swords, shields, and spears for soldiers who would never know the names of those who forged their weapons. Her own chains clinked with every step. When she entered the forge hall, the heat struck her like a wave, unbearable to most but familiar to her. "Work begins at dawn," Oben said. "You will start with bellows and coal. If you prove useful, you may touch the hammer." His tone was neither cruel nor kind, simply factual, as though mercy were a resource best conserved. Arya bowed her head in silence. She knew better than to speak. In slavery, silence was armor. Days turned into weeks. Arya worked without rest, hauling coal, fanning flames, shaping iron bars into crude weaponry. Her chains never left her wrists, not even when she slept. They said it was to remind her who she was, property. Yet every clang of hammer and anvil only reminded her who she used to be. She watched Oben work, the precision in his strikes, the care in his craft. Though he served a cruel purpose, he respected the metal. That respect was the only thing Arya could mirror without breaking character. At night, when others collapsed from exhaustion, she stayed awake by the dying embers. She would hold the chains and study the faint runes that glimmered when the forge fire flickered low. They spoke to her now, clearer than before. Not in words, but in rhythm, like a heartbeat under her skin. When she placed her hand on the anvil, she could feel that same pulse running through the iron bars stacked nearby. All metal, she realized, was connected by the same ancient breath. The first time she tested her will, it was an accident. Oben had left her alone with a sword that had cracked during tempering. She touched the fracture and whispered softly, a habit born from years of forging. The crack sealed before her eyes, the metal mending itself as though time had reversed. Her heart pounded. It was not fire alone that had done it. It was her will, the same force that once shaped iron into art back home. From that moment, her nights became lessons in secret magic. Each swing of the hammer by day was matched with silent experimentation by night. She learned how to guide the heat, not by strength but by intent. When she wished the flames to rise, they obeyed. When she needed the metal to soften, it yielded. Her chains, once symbols of her captivity, became her instruments of practice. She would hold them in the fire until they glowed red, whispering the same ancient rhythm until sparks bent toward her fingertips like obedient servants. But she never let the overseers see. Her obedience became her camouflage. She worked harder than anyone else, never complained, never met a master's eyes unless spoken to. Her quiet nature earned her a reputation, the silent one, they called her, the girl who works as if the fire itself listens to her. Oben took notice. One evening he approached her as she shaped a spearhead. "You learn fast," he said, watching her movements. "Most burn their hands for months before they understand the language of heat. But your hands already know the fire." Arya did not answer. "Where did you learn?" he pressed. "From my father," she said simply. "He taught me that fire is not to be feared, only respected." Oben nodded, oddly thoughtful. "A wise lesson. Remember it. Fire gives life to iron, but it takes it from the careless." He walked away, unaware that the girl he had bought as a slave was slowly rewriting the laws of his forge. That night, after everyone slept, Arya took a fragment of broken chain and placed it upon the anvil. She whispered to it, and the metal glowed faintly, its runes brightening like waking eyes. She pressed her palms together, focusing her will, and the links began to shift. They twisted and merged into a single loop that fit snugly around her wrist like a bracelet. When she moved her hand, it shimmered, half invisible in the dark. The rest of her chains rattled faintly, responding like creatures sensing their kin. Arya smiled for the first time in months. The metal was no longer her cage, it was her ally. She had learned to forge without tools, to shape iron through thought, to enchant through will. Each weapon she made for her captors carried a secret, a breath of her command, a memory of her defiance. The other slaves began to notice strange things. Swords cooled faster in her hands. Armor polished itself smoother when she touched it. Some swore they saw the flames bend toward her, as if drawn to her presence. They whispered that she was chosen by the gods of the forge. Arya said nothing. She kept her secret close, feeding it like a hidden ember. One day she promised herself that ember would become a blaze. The forge that had enslaved her would burn with her power, not as a place of bondage, but as the cradle of a rebellion no chain could ever hold. For now she bowed when spoken to, obeyed every command and waited. Each day she grew stronger, her will sharper, her fire quieter. She was the perfect slave on the surface, humble, tireless, silent. But beneath that silence, the metal remembered her voice. And soon the fire would too. Late one night, when the forge fires had dimmed and the others slept, Arya sat alone in the quiet glow of dying embers. The air was still heavy with the scent of smoke and steel, but beneath it she heard something else, faint like a breath drawn from the heart of the metal itself. At first she thought it was her imagination, the exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But when she held her wrist close to the forge, the sound grew clearer. The chains that bound her were humming. It wasn't a melody made by wind or movement. It was deeper, older, a low vibration that pulsed through the metal, as though each link carried its own heartbeat. She touched one and the hum grew warmer. It wasn't just noise, it was a kind of voice. Each clink, each faint echo held memory, of those who had worn it before, of sweat and struggle, of strength refusing to die. Arya closed her eyes and listened, and for the first time the chains didn't feel cold. She began to listen every night. The hum became a rhythm, and the rhythm became a song, one without words yet full of meaning. When she whispered to it, the metal seemed to answer, rising and falling like the breath of something alive. Slowly she began to remember stories her grandmother once told, back in Wand. Tales of the first blacksmiths, who sang to the mountains and pulled metal from its heart using only their voice. They called it the Song of Iron, a hymn of creation, of unity between human spirit and the bones of the earth. The realization struck her like fire through her veins. The song wasn't lost, it had been waiting, buried within her blood. Every spark she had seen, every whisper of heat that obeyed her, it had all been leading her back to this. The chains she wore were not simply tools of oppression. They were relics of the same force her ancestors once commanded. The very instruments meant to contain her now carried the key to something greater, something divine. Each night she practiced in secret. She would hum softly, her voice barely above a whisper, following the pulse of the metal. Sometimes the flames flickered in rhythm. Sometimes the chains shifted slightly, responding to her tone. When she reached the right pitch, a faint shimmer ran through the iron, and the sound deepened, harmonizing with her voice until it felt like the forge itself was breathing with her. As the days passed, even the other workers began to feel the change. The air in the forge grew different when Arya entered. Sparks seemed to linger longer, fires burned steadier, and tools left near her glowed faintly after she touched them. The slavers dismissed it as coincidence, but the older slaves whispered that she had found the voice of the ancestors, that the metal obeyed her as it once did the gods of the forge. Arya never corrected them. She only smiled faintly and kept singing under her breath. Each verse she discovered carried her deeper into understanding, that strength was not in breaking the chains, but in making them remember who forged them first. One evening, as she sang quietly beside the fire, the chains around her wrists loosened for the first time. Not enough to fall, but enough to breathe. She didn't try to free herself, not yet. She traced the runes glowing faintly on the links and whispered, "Not yet. You and I have work to do." The chains pulsed once in reply, a soft vibration that felt like agreement. They were no longer her shackles. They were her companions, her choir. Together they carried the Song of Iron, a forgotten hymn now rising once again from the ashes of captivity. And though no one else could hear it, the forge walls trembled faintly with its power, a promise of what was coming. The nights in the forge had grown long, but Arya's resolve had grown longer still. She had learned the rhythm of the chains, the subtle music of iron, and with it she discovered a way to reach beyond her own shackles. Not just her own but those of the others. Each slave's chains hummed differently, resonating with their individual strength and fear. Arya began experimenting quietly, humming the Song of Iron, in ways that drew out the latent energy embedded in the metal. It began with small miracles. A cuffed wrist would slip free just enough for a slave to shift their fingers. A padlock would loosen its teeth ever so slightly when she passed by. Nothing overt, nothing that would draw suspicion. The masters and guards thought it coincidence. They didn't notice the faint glimmer in the iron, the almost imperceptible pulse that seemed to follow Arya wherever she moved. Word began to spread among the captives. At first, it was whispered in the dark corners of the sleeping quarters. "Did you feel that? My chains, they moved by themselves. I swear it. When Arya hummed last night, my shackles warmed and shifted." Fear had long ruled the hearts of the slaves, but now for the first time there was hope. Hope given not by rebellion in open sight, but by a subtle, unseen force. Arya became a silent leader, her power hidden in shadow, her voice carried through the hum of metal. The guards noticed little at first. The forge continued as it always had, though strange things began to happen. Hammers would drop just out of reach. Chains rattled in rhythm without any hands to move them. Sparks would leap into the air, landing gently without burning anything. The overseers whispered among themselves, calling it odd, unnatural, and perhaps a curse. Oben, though suspicious, only watched quietly, his sharp mind sensing that the girl's obedience was not as simple as it seemed. Arya worked methodically. Each night she would walk among the captives, humming softly, touching their chains and cuffs. The metal responded to her intent, warm and pliable, obeying the tune of her song. She whispered guidance to each slave: "Trust the chain. Trust yourself. Let it remember your strength." Slowly, those who had been beaten into submission learned to move within their bonds, flexing their wrists, preparing for a time when freedom would be within reach. It was not just physical liberation she nurtured. The Song of Iron carried emotion, courage, resolve, and unity. The slaves, though frightened, began to feel connected to each other through Arya's subtle influence. Where there had been despair, a quiet confidence began to bloom. Chains that had symbolized powerlessness now hummed with the possibility of defiance. The turning point came one evening when a guard entered the sleeping quarters unexpectedly. A slave jerked upright, panicked, and the chains rattled loudly. Arya, calm, extended her hands and hummed under her breath. The metal responded immediately, wrapping softly around the wrist, immobilizing it for only a moment before relaxing as if acknowledging her control. The guard, convinced of some trick of the wind or a fleeting hallucination, left, muttering to himself about spirits and curses. But the slaves had seen the proof. The chains listened to Arya. Soon stories began to circulate beyond the forge. Whispers of a girl who could bend iron to her will spread through the slave quarters and beyond. The Iron Whisperer, they called her, a name that carried awe and hope. Rumors reached the overseers, who dismissed it as superstition, yet unease gnawed at them. Their strongest slaves, and perhaps even their most loyal, were beginning to move differently, cautiously, almost in rhythm with some unseen signal. Arya continued to weave her quiet rebellion. Each night, the Song of Iron grew stronger, each note harmonizing with a new chain, a new cuff, a new lock. She taught the slaves to feel their own strength, to channel it through the iron as a medium. Soon, even the guards noticed subtle changes in behavior. Tools slightly out of place, shackles mysteriously loosened, doors that seemed to open with less resistance. Anxiety spread among the overseers, who began fearing what they could not understand. The rebellion was no longer just in whispered movements or gentle shifts. The chains themselves became participants. When Arya hummed, they resonated, vibrating in sympathy and anticipation. Metal clasps loosened, bars bent ever so slightly, and tools leaned toward the captives as if drawn by unseen hands. Her song became a chorus of defiance that no human could silence, echoing faintly through the walls of the forge. One night the slaves gathered secretly. Arya's presence was central, her chains glowing faintly under the moonlight that seeped through cracks in the roof. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice low but resolute, "we will no longer wait for mercy. We will take what is ours. The chains will serve us, not them." The slaves nodded, their hands resting on the iron that had once bound them, feeling it pulse in tune with Arya's song. By the time dawn broke, the forge was alive with quiet power. The overseers and guards moved among the slaves, expecting compliance, but instead met subtle resistance everywhere. Tools slightly shifted, chains stubbornly tight or loose at strategic moments, a subtle unease that could not be explained. Fear had taken root, growing from whispers, shadows, and metal that seemed alive. Arya smiled, unseen, knowing that the revolt had begun in the quietest way possible. Her chains, once symbols of her captivity, had become instruments of liberation. The slaves felt their power surging through the iron. The forge, the prison, the chains themselves, all were now allies in the making of a revolution. And the overseers, who believed they controlled everything, began to tremble at the whispering, humming promise that change was coming. The Iron Whisperer was no longer a legend in the making. She was reality, and the shadows themselves were her army. The night was heavy with tension. The master, a cruel man named Dorek, had grown impatient with a perceived mistake in the armory. His wrath was swift and violent. He summoned the slaves to the central forge, the air thick with smoke and fear, and proclaimed that one among them would pay for the failure. Whips cracked, commands barked, and terror gripped every heart. Arya felt the familiar tremor of the chains at her wrists, but tonight, their hum carried a different resonance, a promise of reckoning. She had prepared for this moment. For weeks she had practiced, studied the response of iron and fire to her voice and will. The chains she wore were no longer mere instruments of bondage. They had become conduits of energy, attuned to her intent. As Dorek raised his hand to strike, Arya inhaled deeply, letting the song of iron flow from her core. Her voice, though silent to those expecting mere obedience, vibrated through the metal, awakening it. At first it was subtle. The flames in the forge flickered unnaturally, casting dancing shadows that seemed to twist and bend with intention. Tools rattled, chains shifted on their own, clinking with precise, almost musical cadence. The slaves froze, uncertainty flickering across their faces, while Dorek sneered, believing it to be some coincidence or trick of the light. Then Arya expanded her focus. She extended her hands over the rows of weapons and ironwork. Sparks leapt from the anvil as though alive, hissing in the heated air. Chains snapped free from wrists that had been bound for months, but not violently. They hovered, obedient to Arya's will. Swords quivered in their racks, axes tilted, hammers lifted. Every object crafted in that forge, meant to wield destruction, now obeyed the one they had once sought to suppress. Dorek's laughter faltered as a sword lifted from its stand and hovered in the air, tip pointed toward him. He barked orders, tried to strike at Arya, but his movements were sluggish, hampered by the subtle yet growing resistance of the enchanted metal. Hammers swung slowly of their own accord, striking the floor with enough force to scatter sparks across the room, startling guards and captives alike. Fear replaced his arrogance. The flames responded next. Fire danced along the forge pits, growing crimson and wild, licking at the rafters without consuming them completely. The air shimmered with heat, yet those aligned with Arya felt nothing but a warm embrace. Smoke swirled into shapes, forming images of the ancestors whose songs had first awakened the chains. Their silent approval bolstered Arya's confidence, urging her to push further. With a final deep breath, Arya let the song of iron surge outward, linking every chain, weapon, and tool to her intent. The slaves watched in awe as their bonds rose into the air, forming intricate patterns of gleaming metal. Swords and spears spun gently, axes danced in arcs, and the fire blazed in harmonious rhythm with the movement. The rebellion was no longer hidden. It had manifested physically, spectacularly, undeniable to all who witnessed it. The overseers tried to flee, but the chains blocked their path, guiding them toward the center of the forge where Arya stood. They could not escape without stepping into the very instruments they had used to oppress others. Each attempted movement was countered by a precise response of iron and fire, never harming innocence but restraining the tyrants with elegant inevitability. The slaves, sensing their liberation, moved cautiously at first, then with confidence, guided by Arya's silent commands. They had been prepared for this, trained in secret by the subtle teachings and vibrations Arya had imparted for weeks. Now they acted as one, freeing those still bound, coordinating with the living metal to seize control of the space without a single unnecessary casualty. By the time the night had reached its peak, the forge had transformed. Crimson flames illuminated a scene of upheaval and liberation. Every chain, every weapon, every spark moving in perfect harmony with Arya's will. The masters and guards, once feared, were subdued, not by brute force alone, but by the revelation that the instruments of oppression could be instruments of justice if wielded by the right hands. Arya stood at the center, the fire reflecting in her eyes, the chains around her wrists glowing with power rather than bondage. She had not destroyed the forge, she had transformed it. The rebellion had begun, not with chaos for its own sake, but with a display of control, intelligence, and moral authority. The song of iron hummed through every object, every link, every spark, and it carried with it the promise that the enslaved would no longer be silent, that their liberation was at hand, and that the night of fire would be remembered for generations. You said. The first light of dawn crept through the high windows of the forge, glinting off iron chains that hovered silently in the air, obedient to Arya's command. The enslaved, once trembling at the slightest glance of their masters, now moved with a quiet confidence that came from understanding the power that had always been theirs to wield. Arya stood at the center, her hands raised as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The chains that had bound them for years twisted and coiled like serpents, responding to her subtle motions, their metal humming with anticipation. The masters, groggy from fear and disbelief, stumbled into the main hall, their eyes wide at the sight of their captives no longer shackled, the very chains they had relied upon for control now swirling in graceful arcs above the heads of the oppressed. Arya's gaze met theirs, steady and unyielding but not cruel. There was no malice in her eyes, only the clear, undeniable authority of someone who had endured injustice and learned its hidden strength. A tremor ran through the floor as the chains began to descend, not to strike, but to form barriers that blocked the master's escape. Their whips and clubs clattered harmlessly to the floor as their own weapons were subtly lifted, turned away, or bound by Arya's precise control. Panic spread among the oppressors. Their arrogance dissolved in the face of the power they had underestimated for so long. Each step they took was met with a deliberate, elegant resistance, a reminder that the world had shifted, that the instruments of cruelty could now enforce accountability. The enslaved moved quietly but with purpose, guided by Arya's silent commands. Some freed fellow captives in the inner chambers, their chains lifting from their wrists without a word, as if the metal itself recognized the change in its master's heart. Others secured the doors and exits, ensuring the masters could not flee and sow further chaos. Arya's presence was magnetic, every subtle gesture radiating authority. She had become more than a leader, more than a liberator. She was a symbol, a living testament to resilience and ingenuity born from suffering. The masters fell to their knees, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. "Mercy," they begged, voices shaking. "Please, we did not know, forgive us." But Arya did not answer with violence. Instead, she allowed the chains to hover around them, forming intricate patterns of metal that seemed to cradle their bodies rather than strike. Each link reflected the faces of those who had suffered under their hands, a silent ledger of their cruelty. Then Arya spoke, her voice carrying a resonance that had nothing to do with fear but everything to do with justice. "You will learn the cost of what you built on the backs of others. You will be free of these chains, not because I forgive you, but because you must live to witness the liberation you once denied." Her words carried through the hall, vibrating through the metal and into the hearts of everyone present. The chains began to move with purpose, guiding the enslaved to gather tools and supplies for their journey to freedom. Each link and bar became a symbol of power reclaimed, and as the slaves moved, the metallic hum of iron accompanied them like a chorus celebrating their newfound autonomy. Arya's hands gestured toward the doors, and the chains formed protective arches, ensuring no harm could come to those who had suffered for so long. The masters, still kneeling, realized that they were no longer in command of the world they had known. Their strength had been contingent on the suppression of others, and that suppression was gone. Arya approached, her gaze steady. She raised one hand, and the chains coiled lightly around the oppressors, lifting them from the floor just enough to instill awe and humility, but without causing pain. "Rise," she commanded, and they obeyed, trembling. "You will walk with the weight of your deeds in your hearts. Only then may you understand the balance you disrupted." The enslaved, now fully free, stepped past the masters, each carrying themselves with dignity and self-assuredness. There was no celebration of revenge, no gleeful retribution. Instead, there was a calm, righteous reclamation of life, of purpose, of self. The chains, once symbols of submission, now shimmered with possibility, a reminder that oppression could be transformed into liberation when wielded with wisdom. Outside the forge, sunlight spilled across the courtyard, catching on iron and steel, reflecting the new dawn of a community reclaimed. The masters were left to contemplate their failings, humbled and forced to reckon with the consequences of their cruelty. Arya, surrounded by those she had freed, looked at the horizon, understanding that her journey had only begun. The chains that had once held them captive were now tools of justice, of guidance, of protection, and above all, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience born from suffering. The night of fire had ended, but the breaking of masters was complete. No swords or whips were required, only the wisdom, courage and mastery of one who had endured the deepest chains of oppression. Arya had turned weakness into strength, suffering into insight, and bondage into a path for liberation. The village of Nwand would never forget the night when chains became keys, the night when a single woman's courage reshaped the fate of all. you said. The road to Nwand was long, winding through hills and forests that had once seemed ordinary but now shimmered with memory. Arya walked at the forefront, the fragments of her chains secured in a satchel at her side. Each link, once a symbol of oppression, had been melted down and reforged into small charms and tools, reminders of endurance, resilience, and transformation. The enslaved who had followed her looked on in quiet admiration, carrying seeds, provisions, and hope for the homeland they had been forced to leave behind. As they approached the outskirts of Nwand, the village appeared much as Arya remembered it, yet changed in subtle ways. Homes were worn, fields overgrown, and the air carried the faint weight of abandonment. But the people who had suffered under betrayal and loss noticed the group before the buildings themselves. Children paused in their play, elders leaned on worn staffs, and the villagers gathered slowly, murmuring anxiously about the returning daughter of their land. Arya's gaze swept over the familiar faces, recognizing the mixture of fear, curiosity, and longing. She stepped forward, holding high one of the melted chain fragments, now shaped into a small sun emblem. The metal glinted in the sunlight, catching every eye. "These," she said, her voice calm but carrying the authority of experience, "are the remnants of what once bound us. They no longer represent pain but the strength we forged from it." The villagers looked from her to the group she had led, understanding dawning. Those who had been enslaved alongside Arya now moved with quiet dignity, their presence a testament to the power of courage, unity, and cunning. The children whispered among themselves, pointing to the glimmering chains that had been transformed into tools. Small hammers, rings, and charms, each carrying the memory of suffering turned to wisdom. Arya set about rebuilding the village with deliberate care. Homes were repaired, walls reinforced, and fields cleared. Every act was imbued with intention, guided by the lessons learned during her captivity. She taught the villagers to weave the fragments of melted chains into practical tools, embedding symbols of unity and resilience into daily life. Hammers and plows bore etchings of chains now broken, water jugs carried patterns of linked metal reimagined as protection, and door handles bore small rings forged from the very metal that had once enslaved them. The elders, initially hesitant, came to witness the transformation. Arya spoke to them not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, guiding them to understand the lessons of the past. "We have all been bound," she said, "but our chains do not define us. The strength we discover within them and in one another defines the future we build together." Slowly trust returned. The villagers began to work alongside her, clearing fields, repairing homes, and learning to melt the metal into symbols of cooperation rather than control. At the village center, Arya erected a small forge, smaller than the master's forge she had left behind, but powerful in its symbolism. Here villagers could work together, creating tools and ornaments that reminded them of the night the enslaved became free. The forge's flames were controlled, warm, and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos of the rebellion that had taken place in the distant kingdom. It became a place of education, reflection, and unity, where the wisdom gained through suffering could be shared with all. When the first crops were planted under Arya's guidance, the villagers noticed a subtle shift in the land. The soil seemed richer, the streams clearer, and the wind carried whispers of renewal. The chains melted and reforged into plows, scythes, and watering tools, each artifact blending the practical with the symbolic. Life began to return to Nwand, stronger and more harmonious than before, anchored by the lessons of endurance, cunning, and courage. Arya stood at the edge of the village as the sun dipped toward the horizon, holding a delicate charm forged from a link of her chains. The metal gleamed softly, reflecting the light of the setting sun, and she felt the energy of the land, the people, and the past flowing through her. The chains that had once confined her had become instruments of restoration, unity, and hope. In the distance, the villagers gathered for a quiet celebration, sharing stories of survival, courage, and the woman who had turned her captivity into liberation. Arya's gaze fell upon the horizon, understanding that Nwand was not merely rebuilt, it had been reborn. The fragments of chains, melted and reforged, were no longer remnants of suffering. They were the foundation of a new community, a living testament to the power of resilience, wisdom, and the enduring strength of one who refused to remain enslaved. Through patience, courage, and the careful guidance of Arya, Nwand thrived once more, a village strengthened not by wealth or force, but by the lessons learned from suffering transformed into wisdom, the chains of bondage recast as symbols of unity and hope. You said. The heart of Nwand had changed. Under Arya's guidance, the villagers gathered in the central square, where a wide circle of earth had been cleared. Here they began an unprecedented task, to forge a monument that would embody both their suffering and their triumph. Using the melted fragments of chains that had once bound Arya and the enslaved, they shaped thick iron rods and plates, carefully heating, hammering, and bending them. Sparks danced in the air as hammers struck metal, but these sparks carried a different energy now, not of destruction but of hope and creation. Arya moved among them, her hands guiding their strikes, her voice calm but resonant. "Each piece you bend," she said, "carries the story of pain endured and courage discovered. Do not shape it with anger alone. Let your hands bind it with understanding, with care, with love. That is the power that transforms chains into strength." The villagers listened intently, feeling for the first time that their labor was not servitude but a conscious act of creation, a shaping of history into tangible form. As the iron began to take shape, the design revealed itself. A towering tree, its trunk made of interwoven chains, each link symbolizing a story of survival, endurance, and resistance. From this trunk, branches spiraled outward, reaching toward the sky, each tipped with forged leaves and blossoms of metal, glimmering in the sunlight. Children watched in awe as the monument grew, understanding intuitively that it represented not only freedom but life itself, the transformation of oppression into something nurturing and enduring. Arya demonstrated the technique of binding through love, not fear. Unlike the harsh, coercive methods of the past overseers, this approach required patience and attentiveness. Every link had to be connected with intention, every curve of the metal shaped with respect for its history. She explained, "Chains forced upon you are painful. But when we reshape them with care, they no longer control us. They become tools, guides, and reminders of what we can create together." The villagers embraced this idea, recognizing that power exercised without compassion corrupts, while strength exercised with love uplifts. Hours turned into days as the iron tree rose from the ground. Villagers sang softly while working, melodies inspired by Arya's whispered instructions, carrying the energy of resilience through every stroke of hammer and every fold of metal. The heat from the forge mingled with the cool air, creating a shimmering aura around the emerging monument. Even the birds and animals of Nuan seemed to sense the shift. They gathered near the square, perching on the edges, observing silently as the tree grew, its presence commanding yet serene. When the final leaves were affixed, Arya stepped back with the villagers, the tree standing tall against the sky, a testament to unity and rebirth. Each chain that had once symbolized suffering was now an integral part of a living, breathing monument, radiating power transformed by purpose and love. It was not merely iron and metal but the crystallized essence of every act of courage, every moment of endurance, and every decision to act with wisdom rather than vengeance. The villagers understood the deeper lesson. True freedom is not only the breaking of chains but the ability to reshape them for the good of all. Arya addressed them, her voice carrying both pride and humility. "This tree is our story, our promise. Remember it not as a relic of pain, but as a symbol of what we can achieve when we act with care, compassion, and love. Our chains no longer bind us, they guide us." The iron tree became the heart of Nuan, a central gathering place where villagers reflected, taught, and celebrated their shared history. Generations would come to see it, not as a reminder of oppression, but as a monument of empowerment, resilience, and the enduring truth that even the heaviest chains, when handled with love, can be transformed into instruments of life and liberation.